Hello! While coming a few years after the iMuse, Dancing Mad from Final Fantasy VI of 1994 was a prominent example of horizontal resequencing on the SNES. The music follows the different stages of the fight, sometimes so seamless the player won't even realize what's going on. But how did it work? Before we begin. Dancing Mad is a wonderful piece of music in its use of themes and connected materials to tell a story with only music, and also to conclude a great epic game. I won't talk about that in this video and only focus on the adaptivity of the music. But I would really recommend you to watch some of all the other videos about the storytelling part of this piece, because that's a really important part. I would even say that it's hard to fully appreciate the piece without it. Second, this analysis will be based upon the original SNES version of the game. Concerning the dynamic music, some other versions of the game sometimes work out quite differently. And opposite to how the world usually functions, the adaptive music haven't always become better in later versions. But enough of intros, let's begin. The music can be divided into 4 main loops, accompanying the 4 parts of the battle. The first 3 of those are the 3 different levels of the Statue of the Gods, all connected through the same graphic tower, and the 4th one being Kefka himself. We simply call these loops Loop 1 to 4. In addition to these 4 loops, there are 4 linear segments. These are short musical passages that aren't looped, and when they end, they simply continue to the next loop, or in the last case, to the next cutscene. We call these Interlude 1 to 4. Most of these interludes aren't in separate files, but are included in the next music file. This thanks to the SPC file's built-in function for an intro before the file's main loop. Only the 4th interlude, Kefka's Death Rumble, is in a completely single file. The 3rd interlude, on the other hand, is split in 2. The first half as a single file, and the second part in the intro to the 4th prog rock loop accompanying Kefka's battle. Now, when we start combining these musical modules, there are a lot of angles that may be covered. There are 3 points that are usually worth to reflect about in every new combination. And those are timing, or how closely must the music follow the gameplay? Would it be a problem if there were a bit of lag before the music adapts? Or can the music easily adapt to gameplay a few bars later than the actual event? Contrast. How widely separated are the modules that will be combined? If both sections of music sound similar, the seams are easier to hide. And transition. That is, exactly how do we move from one segment to the next and make them connect? Or sometimes not connect. The transition becomes more important if there are a great contrast between 2 modules. But if there are a very short time span for the transition to happen, it will also be harder to make it smooth. On the other hand, a very unsmooth transition may accentuate the contrast between the 2 materials, which may or may not be a goal for the composer. When it comes to contrast, two important variables are tempo and key. And to get different keys to work together, you usually will have to keep an eye on the harmony. A third parameter is the timbre, but let's just give that a short thought and then leave it. Having a look at the first page of the score, we can notice that there are quite a number of instruments. And yeah, if you are watching this on a mobile phone, you might miss out on a few small details due to screen size, but I think you will still get the main picture. But while there are plenty of instruments, there are a couple of common sounds throughout the whole piece that really ties it together. The organ goes like a red line through every movement, although with 3 different samples. With both cymbal and snare in the classical percussion as well as in the drum kit, also the percussion follows a common timbre throughout. It's even the same cymbal sample, while the snare differs. Also, the choir comes close to be a common denominator, missing in 2 of the loops, but present in the more of the interludes. And there is a laughing track with Kefka's laughter. I guess that makes Final Fantasy a sitcom by definition. The important thing is, with the less contrast in timbre, it won't be a great issue to the adaptivity. So, we start with the transition from the second loop to the third, because chronological order is so boring. This movement's transition is by the end of the loop, simply meaning, when the end of the loop is reached, the game tests for what part of the statue is battled. If the player is still in purgatory, the loop starts over. But if the Pietà has been reached, the music will instead continue to the second interlude, and then to the third loop. The start of loop 2 has a BPM of 115, while interlude 2 is in 85 beats per minute. But ending with a huge ritardando solves this, and both of the pathways sounds like a restart of the tempo. Key-wise, loop 2 starts in C# minor. The interlude only contains one tone, C#, but when the third loop starts, it's obvious that we are in C# major. This isn't a new key though. Loop 2 shifted towards major already in bar 17, only to soon thereafter detour to, well, other places. The end of the loop can best be described as polychordal, with an open fifth of G and D above an open fifth of G# and D#. The bottom of this chord can easily be perceived as a dominant chord to C#, but without the third or the seventh. The upper tones in their turn leads chromatically to the prime and the fifth of the C-sharp chord, but none of the chords has anything to do with the third, and coming from a couple of less tonal bars, the end leads smoothly to both minor and major. There is one risk with this kind of transition. From the moment you defeat the boss, you have to wait for the transition point before the music continues to the next section. And if you would manage to defeat the boss too soon after the loop has restarted, you might be in for a rather long wait. The transition between the first and second boss is similar, but with one great difference. Instead of choosing to loop or continue at the end of the loop, the transition point instead comes in the middle of the loop, at the end of bar 14 to be more precise. This doesn't solve the problem with delayed timing. The player may still defeat the boss exactly after the transition point was passed, but it has a number of other qualities. Many listeners are quite aware of loops, and the point where you start to recognize the music again sticks out. This may be both positive and negative depending on the listener, but the important thing is that the listener is aware. In this case it would have been even more obvious, because it's the first part of the boss fight and there is no intro. The point you loop to would be the absolute first thing you heard of the music. And if you aren't the greatest gamer, there is a chance you will have heard this beginning a couple of times due to death. If the looping point and the transition point is the same, that means that the construction of the musical form also becomes more obvious, which in the case of dynamic music often isn't anything you want. To instead transition in the middle of the loop can give a more through-composed impression of the piece. This time the transition also has to modulate, from the first loop's C minor to the second loop's C sharp minor. The last chord before the transition point is a D7 with a 7th in the bass. In C minor this would be the dominant of the dominant, expected to lead to the dominant chord. But Nobuo Uematsu often uses this chord, like this with the tonic as a pedal point, only to return to the tonic. So by this point, in the end of the game, the player would be perfectly used to the tonic that comes in the next bar. if the sound have been off for the whole game. Mr. Uematsu used that progression a lot in Final Fantasy V. And in the case the player is American, it was used in Final Fantasy IV. Uematsushi have been doing that harmonic movement for a while. When transitioning to the first interlude, on the other hand, the D7 gets another function. This time it becomes a Triton substitute. That is a substitute for the G♯7, leading to C# minor. This kind of double function, when the D7 can have two different harmonic functions depending on gameplay pathway, is a useful tool when it comes to modulations in dynamic music. And it's rather cool too.
Oh, yeah.
If continuing, the tempo shifts from 60 to 115, which may pass as a doubling of the tempo. At least almost. The third transition is something completely different. There isn't any single transition point, but the transition comes on cue, that is, the exact moment the next stage of the fight begins. And instead of a continuation of the music, we get a fade out, and then the start of the third interlude. The reason for this, maybe slightly more primitive, transition is probably timing. The first three bosses were rather similar. They were even part of the same statue and with the same background. The music likewise had a lot of similarities, especially when it came to the instrumentation. Therefore, I would argue that the exact synchronization between the music stages and the boss stages wasn't that important, and the risk of delays were acceptable. You don't have to agree to this, of course. That's what the comment sections are there for. When we come to the final fight though, timing is everything. We get a new background, the sun syncs with the interlude, we get a completely new boss, and the music is, well, new. Now imagine that this musical transition got delayed half a minute because of a transition point. That would ruin everything. The tonality is worth mentioning here. While both sections relate to C#, the third loop has a bit of a journey. It starts in C# major, then C# minor, only to modulate to G minor, touch G major, and then use a row of diminished 7 chords to crawl back to the C# major it came from. And every one of those keys could be the one that fades out to the next section. Fortunately, the third interlude starts with a 6-tone quartal chord from E, and as quartal chords doesn't tend to be that key defining, it works rather well no matter where you left the third loop. Continuing by shifting between F minor with a major 7th and a half-diminished F chord doesn't need to scream any specific key until the electric bass decides the final key decisively. The last transition comes when Kefka is killed. This one too is on cue, but this time with a crossfade, or almost a crossfade. There were only 8 channels to use on the SNES, and the 4th loop used all of them. So, when Kefka dies, channel 7 and 8 stops playing music and starts fade in the death noise, while channel 1 to 6 fades out. Channel 7 and 8 contain the crash cymbal, the lower part of the guitar, and most notably the flute. But the loss for those few seconds is quite comparable to the voice stealing of the regular sound effects. So, in the end 4 transition techniques were used. Transition from a single transition point, transition at the end of a loop, fade out and a new start, and crossfade. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.